Phuoc Tuy Province, Vietnam, May 1968. The old-growth forest never sleeps. Even in the sweltering midday heat of summer, when temperatures reach 38 degrees Celsius and humidity clings to the skin like a slimy film, the forest remains frighteningly vibrant. The buzzing of cicadas is like a drill piercing the brain. The smell of decaying leaves, damp basalt soil, and the characteristic pungent odor of tropical vegetation create a suffocating atmosphere weighing heavily on the chests of anyone unfamiliar with this place. For Sergeant James Miller of Bravo Company, United States Marine Corps, that smell was one of disgust. Miller and his platoon had been marching for 3 days. They were the embodiment of American military might, large, noisy, and heavily armed. On each soldier's shoulder was a heavy Alice Pack backpack filled with ammunition. Sea rations, water, and even letters from home. In their hands were gleaming black M16 symbols of modern warfare technology. On their heads were heavy M1 helmets covered in Mitchell camouflage. They moved across tall grass, cutting through trees with machetes, creating an exposed trail. The clang of metal against metal, the crackling of walkie-talkies, the swearing of someone tripping over a root. They didn't need to be silent. They were top predators. Their philosophy was simple. If the enemy appeared, crush them with firepower. Miller stopped, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and lit a cigarette. Smoke rose swirling in the still air. He was confident. The entire platoon was confident. They believed no force could withstand the storm of fire they carried. But less than 500 meters away, a completely different story was unfolding. A story Miller was about to witness, and it would change his perception forever. On the edge of a dry stream bed, another troop of soldiers was moving. They weren't clearing the path. They were weaving through thorny bushes. They weren't wearing helmets, but instead soft, sweat-soaked, floppy hats. They had no flashy insignia. Their faces were smeared with black and green camouflage cream. It was a patrol of the Australian Special Air Service, ASF. The difference between these two forces was like the difference between a tank and a leopard. One relied on brute force, the other on deadly stealth. And fate was about to bring these two worlds together. Around 2:00 p.m., the silence was shattered. Bang, bang, bang. The Australian 7.62mm SLR rifles fired with a dry, sharp, and distinct sound. A stark contrast to the crisp, resounding bursts of the American M16S. The SAS platoon had engaged a North Vietnamese forward reconnaissance group. From his position, Sergeant Miller signaled the American soldiers to stop and observe. They were on a high mound overlooking the valley where the fighting was taking place. Miller raised his binoculars. He expected to see a heroic display. He expected to see the Australian soldiers, their allies, form a line charge forward and wipe out the enemy. But what Miller saw stunned him. Then came contempt. Immediately after the first volley, the Australian soldiers did not advance. They retreated. They performed the breaking contact technique. The lead soldier fired 2 shots, then turned and ran behind the second soldier. The second man provided covering fire, then turned and ran. And so the entire Australian platoon retreated in a rhythmic but hurried fashion. They threw purple smoke grenades, obscuring visibility, then vanished into the dense wall of foliage as if they had never existed. There were no battle cries, no last stand, only a retreat. To the American Marines standing on the hill, this scene was ridiculous. It contradicted everything they had been taught at Paris Island training camp. In American military culture, retreat meant failure. Retreat was cowardice. A Marine never turns their back on the enemy. Miller lowered his binoculars, a sneer appearing on his dust-stained face. He turned to his young soldiers, his voice full of mockery. "Look at those Australian idiots." The entire American platoon burst into laughter. "What the hell are they doing?" a private asked sarcastically. They must have remembered it's afternoon tea time. I thought the SAS were something special." Another added, tapping his M60 machine gun. "Turns out they're just a bunch of cowards. They're already running away after a few shots." Laughter rang out, drowning out the tension of the battlefield. American arrogance was at its peak. They looked down into the valley where purple smoke still lingered with a condescending gaze. They felt superior. They had bigger guns, they had more troops, and most importantly, they believed they had greater courage. But they didn't know that the concept of courage in the Vietnamese jungle was a highly misleading one. And sometimes the line between courage and stupidity was as thin as a thread stretched across a trail. To understand why Miller laughed and why that laugh was a fatal mistake, we need to dissect the war psychology of these two forces. The American doctrine was the sledgehammer. The American military came to Vietnam with the mindset of World War II and the Korean War. They believed in statistics and probability. They believed in body counting. When encountering the enemy, the standard American procedure was suppress the enemy with superior firepower, fire superiority. If a Viet Cong soldier fired 1 bullet, the American soldiers would return fire 1,000. Then they would call in artillery call in bombers leveling the battle zone. Finally, the infantry would move in to clean up. Therefore, for American soldiers fleeing before exhausting their firepower was a waste of resources and a national disgrace. They were programmed to win by overwhelming force. The Australian doctrine was the scalpel. Australian SAS soldiers came from a completely different school of thought. They learned a hard lesson from the counterinsurgency war in Malaya. They understood that in Asia, the jungle would neutralize technology. Trees would swallow up artillery shells. Dense foliage would obscure aircraft visibility. The SAS's mission wasn't to capture territory. Their mission was reconnaissance. They were the ears and eyes, not the fists. When a squad of 5 Australian soldiers engaged the enemy, they always assumed they were facing a force 10 times larger. Mathematics didn't support them. Standing still and engaging in cowboy-style gunfights was suicide. Therefore, they developed the shoot and run technique. They fired to startle the enemy, to pinpoint their location, and then retreated immediately. This retreat served 2 extremely insidious tactical purposes. 1. Preservation of forces. They survived to bring valuable intelligence back to base. 2. A psychological trap. When they fled, the enemy's instinct was to pursue. And when the enemy left their defensive positions to pursue, they would be exposed. Or worse, they would be lured into a prearranged ambush. The Australian soldiers didn't run out of fear. They ran to draw the enemy out of their hole. Ironically, Sergeant Miller and the American soldiers didn't understand this. They saw the surface and judged the underlying nature by their own standards. Their lack of understanding of guerrilla tactics, coupled with overconfidence in their firepower, created a deadly blind spot. Back on the hill, the laughter had ceased. Miller tossed his cigarette butt to the ground, shuffling it with the tip of his boot. He felt he needed to do something to assert the Marines' authority. He couldn't let a platoon of enemy soldiers loiter right in front of him without doing anything, especially since the Australians had given up. "All right, listen," Miller ordered, his voice sharp. "We're going down there. We're going to show those Australians how Americans work. We're going to clear that valley and get back in time for dinner." The platoon adjusted their backpacks. The clicking of reloading filled the air with excitement. They formed a line, preparing for a sweep operation. They began to move down the slope. The dense trees lashed against their faces. They weren't tiptoeing. They wanted to make noise. They wanted the enemy to know the Marines were coming. It was a show of force. Miller led the way, his M16 rifle screeching. In his mind, he pictured medals reports of overwhelming numbers of enemy kills. He imagined himself as a hunter herding wild beasts. But he didn't know that a kilometer away, the Australian platoon had stopped. The SAS platoon leader. His face covered in mud pressed his ear to the damp ground. He heard a sound. Not birdsong, not wind. It was the pounding of footsteps, the snapping of branches, the clanging of metal. He shook his head slightly, a cold, pitying look in his eyes. He signaled his men to continue moving away out of the way of the sound. "The Americans!" the platoon leader whispered to the radio operator. "They're coming in! Should we warn them?" the radio operator asked. "It's too late," the platoon leader replied. His eyes fixed on the dark clouds gathering to obscure the sun. "They've awakened the forest." Down in the valley, Sergeant Miller and his platoon had just crossed the invisible line from which the Australians had retreated. They saw the brass casings of SLR rifles scattered on the ground. They smirked. They continued deeper into the darkness of the old forest. They didn't know that the forest silence wasn't emptiness. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath before pouncing. And the Australians' cowardice was in fact a warning they had been too arrogant to heed. The gates of hell had just closed behind them. 2:45 p.m. Miller's platoon had advanced about 300 meters into the valley. The forest here was denser, the sunlight obscured by the ancient trees creating an eerie, shadowy space. They maintained their formation in a horizontal line. It was a standard sweep formation optimizing forward firepower. But in this dense jungle terrain, crisscrossed with vines and sinkholes, the formation quickly became disjointed. The American soldiers struggled through the thickets, their curses growing louder as thorns snagged on their clothing and equipment. They didn't know that from the moment they passed the Australian position from which they had retreated, they were being watched, not by radar, not by binoculars, but by the naked eyes hidden behind the bushes just meters away. The Viet Cong scouts who had let the Australian troops escape or deliberately avoided engaging them out of fear of the SAS's cunning now saw a much more tempting target. The American soldiers were too noisy. Their thunderous footsteps shook the ground. The sweet scent of cigarette smoke and the smell of industrial soap from their bodies drifted on the wind, indicating the precise location of each soldier. To the guerrillas, this wasn't an attacking force. This was a mobile target practice area. The Viet Cong company commander gestured. Silence. The guerrillas moved silently into position. They didn't line up facing each other. They fanned out to the flanks, forming a giant L shape that completely surrounded the American advance. This was a classic ambush tactic, the L-shaped ambush. The longer side of the L would fire flanking fire, while the shorter side would block the front. When fired, the bullets would crisscross, creating a kill zone where not an inch of land was safe. Miller still led the way, confidently parting the leaves to clear a path. He saw the flattened grass, the tracks of the Australian soldiers' retreat. He chuckled inwardly. They run fast. He didn't realize that the Australians weren't running fast because they were afraid of the bullets. They were running fast because they sensed the unusual silence of this forest. The SAS's sixth sense had saved their lives. Miller, with his loudness and arrogance, had blinded and deafened himself. He took another step. The tip of his boot lightly caught on a thin spiderweb-like fishing line stretched across the trail. A small click echoed, so small that even the rustling of leaves could drown it out. But for the seasoned soldiers, it was the call of death. For a tenth of a second time seemed to stand still. Miller realized his mistake. His eyes widened, staring down at the rope. Boom! The claymore mine planted in the tree trunk exploded. Thousands of steel pellets shot out at supersonic speed, tearing through the air and ripping through the American platoon's front line. The force of the explosion sent Miller flying backward, slamming him against a tree trunk. His ears buzzed. The world suddenly lost all sound, leaving only a red and gray haze of smoke and dust. But that was just the beginning. As soon as the mine exploded, the surrounding forest awakened. From the seemingly harmless bushes, dozens of AK-47s and RPD machine guns simultaneously spewed fire. Muzzle flashes lit up from 3 directions in front, to the left, and to the right. The American platoon was right in the middle of the destruction zone. A hail of bullets rained down mercilessly on the American formation. Those standing upright were felled with the first volley. The remaining soldiers panicked and sprawled on the ground trying to find cover. But nowhere was safe. Bullets from the flanks pierced through the rocks. Bullets from the front pinned them to the mud. Contact, contact, front. A heart-wrenching scream rang out. Chaos engulfed everything. Thick smoke obscured visibility. The acrid smell of gunpowder mingled with the pungent odor of blood in the hot, humid air. Miller scrambled to his feet, his head spinning. His Marine instincts kicked in. He yelled, "Fire back, crush them!" And the Americans did exactly as they had been taught. The M16S began firing. The M60 machine guns began to roar. The American gunfire grew louder, sharper, drowning out the enemies. They fired relentlessly into the bushes ahead. They fired at the shadowy figures. They fired at anything that moved. This was the Mad Minute. In 60 seconds, the American platoon had unleashed thousands of rounds. Branches snapped rocks and dirt flew everywhere. The sheer power of the firepower gave them a little more confidence. They believed no one could survive that storm of fire. But they were wrong. When the American gunfire subsided for reloading, they waited for silence. They waited for the groans of an annihilated enemy. But instead, the AK-47 fire erupted. This time, it was more intense, more accurate. Where were the American soldiers firing? They were firing into the trees. Where were the Viet Cong soldiers firing? They were firing at the American soldiers lying exposed on the ground. Miller realized with horror the truth. They couldn't see the enemy. The enemy was too well camouflaged. Spider holes and field fortifications covered in foliage had swallowed the American bullets. Miller's superior firepower was firing into thin air. He was using a sledgehammer to swat flies. Conversely, the American soldiers were too exposed. Muzzle flashes revealed their position. Miller's shouts of command revealed their position. And worst of all, they were pinned down in a completely disadvantageous terrain. "Nurse, I need a nurse." A cry for help rang out from the left flank. "Machine gunner fire at 10 o'clock." Another shout came from the right flank. Miller tried to regain control. He grabbed the receiver of the radio operator, JTO, huddled beside him. "Base, this is Bravo 26. We're under heavy ambush, coordinates 4590. Artillery support needed immediately, Hender close." But all he heard was the crackling of interference. The dense jungle and deep valleys blocked the radio waves. Or worse, the antenna had been shot down. For the first time since arriving in Vietnam, Miller felt a chilling fear run down his spine. A fear not of death, but of helplessness. All the modern weapons, all the rigorous training, all the arrogant confidence. Now all seemed meaningless against the invisible specters in the jungle. He looked around. His young soldiers, who just moments ago had been laughing and mocking the Australians, were now lying face down in the mud, trembling or wailing in agony. In that moment of despair, the image of the Australian soldiers retreating that afternoon flashed vividly in Miller's mind. Back then, he had laughed at their cowardice. Now he understood. They didn't flee out of fear. They fled because they knew. They had smelled the danger. They had seen this L-shaped trap before it closed. They had chosen survival over illusory glory. They retreated to preserve their strength to fight another day in their own way. And Miller, he had led his soldiers straight into the line of fire only to prove something pointless. His arrogance, the ego of a military superpower, had blinded him to the brutal reality of guerrilla warfare. A bullet grazed Miller's helmet, knocking it off his head. The deafening bang brought him back to reality. He was no longer helmeted. He was naked before death. "Retreat!" Miller yelled, his voice hoarse from the dust and smoke. "All back to the starting line. Move! Move! Now!" But the retreat order was too late. The formation had broken. The encirclement had tightened. The American soldiers tried to crawl back up the slope, but the slippery mud held them back. Every meter retreated cost them blood. In the distance on the hill where the Australians had stopped earlier, the SAS soldiers still sat there. They had heard it all. The frenzied M16 fire, the dull thud of a grenade, and now desperate screams. They didn't laugh. No one laughed. The SAS squad leader lit a cigarette, shielding the flame in his hand. His eyes fixed on the column of black smoke rising from the valley. "Poor fools," he whispered. "I told them so." He turned to the radio operator. "Call base. Report the situation. The American unit has been wiped out or incapacitated. Request a medical evacuation helicopter dust-off to their coordinates. We'll go down there to provide support when night falls." They stood up, adjusting their backpacks. Their faces were cold, expressionless. They were preparing to return to hell, not to fight, but to clean up the mess left by their allies' arrogance. 5:30 p.m. Twilight began to descend over the Phuoc Tuy Valley. The sky turned a deep purple, like the color of the bleeding wounds on the bodies of the American soldiers. A tropical downpour began. The rain washed away the gunfire, but it couldn't erase the pungent smell of blood mixed with mud. At the bottom of the valley, Sergeant Miller's platoon had been torn apart. They huddled together in a small defensive circle behind fallen trees and slippery rocks. More than half were wounded or killed. The remaining men were in a state of shell shock. Their eyes were wide and vacant, their hands trembling as they clutched their rifles, jumping at the slightest clap of thunder. Their firepower was depleted. The M60S, once roaring with pride, lay silent, their barrels red-hot and warped from excessive, uncontrolled firing. Only a few magazines of M16 ammunition remained. Miller leaned against a dead comrade's body. He stared at his hands, stained with mud and blood. The arrogance of the midday had vanished, completely replaced by a chilling despair. He knew what awaited them when night fell completely. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong weren't in a hurry to launch a decisive attack. They were masters of psychological warfare. They were tightening their encirclement slowly and surely, like a giant python. From the darkness of the forest, a loudspeaker boomed a slurred but clear voice. "I surrender, you die tonight. Go home." Giggles and shouts from the enemy echoed from all sides. They were toying with their prey. They knew the Americans couldn't see in the night. They knew the Americans feared the dark. Miller closed his eyes. He remembered his mocking smile when he saw the Australians retreat. "Cowards," he'd said. Now he'd trade his soul for that cowardly skill, the skill of knowing when to disappear. But there was no miracle. Only the pattering of rain on the scattered helmets, sounding like a countdown to death. 80,000 meters away on the hillside, 5 Australian SAS soldiers were preparing to move. No one spoke a word. Orders were given through hand signals. They emptied their heavy backpacks, Bergen rucksacks behind them, hiding them in a thicket of thorns. They only carried what was necessary for killing SLR rifles, ammunition grenades, and daggers. The squad leader, Sergeant Bluey, applied another layer of camouflage cream to his face. This time, he covered his eyelids and behind his ears. He checked his SLR rifle. He unfastened his rifle sling, wrapping black tape around the metal hooks to ensure absolute silence. They stood up. They didn't look like rescuers charging into the gunfire. They looked like ghosts drifting in the rain. Their plan wasn't to charge straight into the encirclement to rescue the Americans. That would be suicide. Their plan was far more ruthless and effective. They would hunt the hunters. The SAS platoon split up, moving in a disjointed arrowhead formation. They walked on the wet leaves without making a sound. They dissolved into the darkness. They became part of the rain. As they approached the outer perimeter of the North Vietnamese, they began to smell the enemy. The smell of tobacco, the smell of rice balls, and the exhilaration of soldiers confident of victory. The North Vietnamese were focusing all their attention on the American platoon in the valley below. They had their backs to the dense jungle, believing that their rear was safe. That was their final mistake. 6:15 p.m. The sky was pitch black. A North Vietnamese RPD machine gunner lay on an embankment, his rifle pointed toward the Americans. He was awaiting the order to fire the final burst. Suddenly, he felt a cold hand clamp over his mouth from behind. Before he could struggle, a sharp dagger silently ended his life. The SAS soldier gently laid the body down, then moved on to the next position. 20 meters away, a group of 3 Viet Cong soldiers huddled together. Bang, 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 3 sharp, dry shots rang out. 3 soldiers fell almost simultaneously, each hit by 2 bullets in the chest double tap. There was no screaming, no deafening machine gun fire in return. Only the sound of rain and the thudding of bodies falling into the mud. Chaos began to spread through the encircling ranks. The North Vietnamese soldiers on the left flank turned around. They saw their comrades dead, but no enemy. Darkness still enveloped them. Where were the bullets coming from? How many were there? Bang bang, 2 more shots rang out from another direction. A North Vietnamese platoon commander fell. At this moment, fear began to grip the minds of the guerrillas. They were facing an invisible enemy. This enemy did not shout charges. This enemy sniped them one by one with absolute precision in the darkness. Ghosts! There are forest ghosts! A panicked cry rang out. The encirclement formation began to crumble. Instead of concentrating fire on the American platoon in the valley, the North Vietnamese soldiers began firing wildly into the woods behind them. The blue flashes of AK rifle fire ripped through the night, but they were only shooting into empty space. The SAS platoon didn't stand still. They shot and scooped. They moved constantly, creating the illusion that they were a large force encircling the North Vietnamese. 5 Australian soldiers, with their discipline and stealth skills, were disrupting an entire enemy company of 60 men. Down in the valley, Sergeant Miller and the surviving American soldiers stared blankly. They heard strange gunfire. Bang, bang. A slow, deadly rhythm. They saw the enemy encirclement suddenly become chaotic. Enemy fire was no longer aimed at them, but was now directed behind them. What the hell is going on? A U.S. private whispered, his hand still gripping his empty M16. Someone's attacking them, Miller exclaimed, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Is it airborne cavalry or Alpha Company? But there were no helicopters, no artillery, only darkness and the dry, rumbling sounds of explosions. About 15 minutes later, the gunfire subsided, and then ceased completely. The North Vietnamese, utterly bewildered at the thought they were surrounded by an elite Special Forces unit, decided to retreat to preserve their strength. They vanished into the jungle as quickly as they had arrived. Silence returned to the valley. A silence heavier than the gunfire. From within, the rain. Dark figures began to appear at the edge of the American defensive perimeter. The American soldiers, terrified, raised their rifles. "Stop, who's there?" Miller yelled, his voice trembling. A voice rang out, calm, cold. And in a thick Australian accent he said, "Calm down, Yankee boys. Don't shoot unless you want to die." 5 soldiers emerged from the shadows. They looked terrifying. Their clothes were tattered and soaking wet. Their faces were smeared black like demons. In their hands were SLRs still emitting light smoke. They moved so silently that not a single branch broke under their feet. Miller lowered his rifle. He recognized them. It was the group of soldiers he had mocked that afternoon. The cowards who had fled. SS Sergeant Bluey stepped up to Miller. He didn't return the mocking laugh, nor did he try to be heroic. He simply glanced at the scattered American corpses, then at Miller's eyes red from crying and fear. "Things are bad, my friend," Bluey said, lighting a cigarette but habitually shielding the flame in his hand. "Next time, if you see us running, you'd better run after us. Don't try to be a hero." That statement was like a slap in the face for Miller, more painful than a shrapnel fragment. Humiliation welled up in his throat. He wanted to argue, to yell that Marines never run. But the words were stuck there, because all around him was evidence of failure. And before him was evidence of professionalism. These cowards had gone to hell, scared the devil away, and returned without shedding a drop of blood. "Pack up," Bluey ordered, his voice turning stern. "We've called dust-off helicopters. They'll be here in 10 minutes. We'll be guarding the perimeter. Don't make any more noise. Enough." The 5 Australian soldiers dispersed again, their backs to the Americans, pointing their guns into the darkness. They stood there, silent as stone statues, forming a living shield, protecting their boisterous and arrogant allies. Miller watched their backs. In the flash of lightning, those figures suddenly seemed enormous. He understood that tonight, he and the other survivors owed these country bumpkins a life, and a lesson they would never forget. 7:00 p.m. The sky was pitch black. From afar, a familiar sound began to break the deathly silence of the valley. Whirl, whirl, whirl. The rotor blades of a UH-1 Huey helicopter sliced through the damp air. For the American soldiers lying gasping for breath in the mud, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of life, of hope, of the way home. Sergeant Miller looked up at the dark sky. Streams of red light from the helicopter's signal lights began to sweep through the trees. The wind from the rotors blew fiercely, scattering dry leaves and splashing rainwater in his face. "Dust-off is coming, mark the landing zone! Hurry!" Miller shouted, trying to muster his last ounce of strength. A trembling American soldier detonated a yellow smoke grenade. The smoke billowed up, carried away by the helicopter's wind, creating an eerie yellow vortex. The evacuation helicopter slowly descended, hovering just above the treetops. A rope ladder was lowered. The uninjured American soldiers helped the wounded climb aboard. Chaos erupted again. Shouts and the deafening roar of engines filled the air. The American soldiers scrambled to climb, wanting to escape this green hell as quickly as possible. But on the outermost perimeter, SAS soldiers remained standing. The wind from the helicopter blew their floppy hats and lashed their tattered clothes, but they didn't move. They had their backs to the helicopter, their rifles pointed toward the dark jungle. They were on guard duty until the very last moment. Miller, now safely seated on the helicopter floor, turned his head to look back. In the flickering light of the beacon, he saw the back of the SAS squad leader, Sergeant Bluey. Miller wanted to say something. A thank you, an apology, or simply an acknowledgement. But the engine noise was too loud. He could only raise his hand in a military salute. A shaky but respectful salute. Bluey turned around. His blackened face blended into the darkness, only his eyes gleaming with a cold glint. He didn't return the salute. He only nodded slightly. A superior's nod to someone who had just learned the most expensive lesson of his life. The helicopter ascended, leaving the valley behind. Miller looked down. He saw that the 5 dark figures hadn't followed. They slowly retreated, and in an instant they vanished completely into the night, as if the jungle had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. The Americans flew to the light. The Australians remained in the darkness. That was where they belonged. 3 days later, Bien Hoa Air Base. Sergeant Miller sat on the edge of a field hospital bed. He had been washed clean. The wound on his shoulder had been bandaged. He was holding a cold can of beer, surrounded by the blaring rock and roll music from the AFVN radio station. Everything seemed normal again. But Miller knew nothing was normal anymore. On the next bunk, a group of fucking new guys, FNGS, who had just arrived in Vietnam were playing cards and chatting. "Hey, boss," one of the young soldiers asked Miller. "I heard your unit just had a big fight. How are the Viet Cong? I bet we beat them senseless, huh?" Miller didn't answer. He stared at his beer can. "And I heard," the young soldier continued, his voice mocking, "those Australians were there too. They looked really scruffy. I saw some SAS guys in the mess hall this morning. They looked like beggars. I bet they don't know how to fight. They're just hiding." The whole group of new recruits burst into laughter. "That's right, look at their flimsy bucket hats. They look like old women going to the market." Crack the beer can in Miller's hand shattered. Beer splattered everywhere. He sprang to his feet and strode toward the new recruits. His gaze, the gaze of someone who had just returned from the dead, immediately silenced the laughter. The room fell silent. "Shut up!" Miller snarled, his voice deep and menacing. "You don't know anything. Those beggars you're laughing at. They're the best warriors in this wretched country. You're laughing at their hats. Those hats let them hear death approaching while you're busy listening to music in your stupid helmets." Miller poked the young soldier in the chest with his finger. "They weren't hiding. They were hunting. And the only reason I'm still standing here listening to your nonsense is because those beggars dragged my corpse out of hell when I was too stupid and arrogant." He tossed the dented beer can into the trash can and walked out into the night. Miller looked up at the starry sky. He realized that war wasn't a movie. War wasn't about who had the bigger gun or who shouted louder. War was the art of survival. And in that art, humility was the most powerful weapon. He had once mocked them as cowards who ran away. Now he understood that act of running away breaking contact required 100 times more courage and iron discipline than charging forward in a frenzied killing spree. It took a great deal of courage to restrain one's ego and do the right thing. Sergeant Miller's story is not unique. It is the epitome of the entire Vietnam War. Why did the American military, with its unprecedented military power, fail to control the jungle? And why did a small force like the Australian SAS achieve such tremendous effectiveness? The answer lies in 2 words: adaptation. The Americans tried to bend the environment to suit them. They used defoliants to strip the trees. They used Rome plow bulldozers to flatten the forests. They used napalm bombs to burn everything. They wanted to turn the jungle battlefield into a flat football field so they could play by their own rules. But nature always wins. The forest always grows back. And the enemy always finds cover. The Australians, on the other hand, accepted changing themselves to adapt to the environment. They accepted the dirt. They accepted the silence. They accepted the slowness. They became part of the ecosystem. Post-war statistics revealed a horrifying truth. The average kill ratio for American units was 1 in 10, but this ratio was often achieved through artillery and air power, not infantry skill. The Australian SAS's kill ratio was 1 in 500, and more importantly, the Australian SAS suffered extremely low casualties. They killed more enemies, but died fewer. Why? Because they fired less. Because they ran more. Because they knew fear. Healthy fear kept them alert, caution kept them alive, and silence kept them victorious. The Americans called the Australian retreat cowardice. The Viet Cong called it a trap, and history calls it professionalism. The war ended more than half a century ago. The forests of Phuoc Tuy are now green again, covering the bomb craters and nameless graves. But the stories of the jungle ghosts remain. In modern Special Forces training manuals around the world, from the US Delta Force to the UK SAS Australian Jungle Patrol tactics, are still considered the gold standard. The lesson of that day's retreat remains relevant. It teaches soldiers that courage isn't blindly rushing to their deaths. Courage is having the intelligence to survive and complete the mission. And for American veterans like Miller, those fortunate enough to survive and return, the most haunting image isn't the deafening explosions. The most haunting image is the backs of the Australian soldiers silently disappearing into the night rain. They didn't need glory. They didn't need recognition. They didn't need anyone to know their names. They arrived in silence. They did the dirty work no one else wanted to do, and they left in silence. That is the eternal silence of true soldiers.